Hello there. Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we have a really fantastic and metal as hell interview with user amandycat, also known as Amanda Brunton, who studies early modern English death culture. We will talk about all sorts of interesting and morbid things like deaths, funerals, and how people like to talk shade about the dead. But before we get to that, as this is the first episode of the month, we have our monthly book drawing for our Patreon supporters. The Patreon helps support the show and keeps it going, and we're so very thankful for all of you for making us one of the most popular history podcasts out there. For $1 a month, you get one book drawing, 2 for $5, and 3 for $10. Please do consider supporting us and get access to all these interesting books. The winner this month will get to choose from Epitaphs, A Dying Art, edited by Samuel Fannis, which brings together more than 250 epitaphs from cemeteries, churchyards, monuments, and historical records. So if this is an episode that you enjoy, this will be a book for you to enjoy. The second book is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which is a novelized account of Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell that comes highly recommended by user Sonnergens Gold, who knows very well. The third is The Incorporation of America, Culture and Society in the Gilded Age, which I am reading and enjoying, and is described as being a brilliant and essential work on the origins of America's corporate culture and the formation of the American social fabric after the Civil War. The winner this month is Hannah M. Thank you very much for being a supporter, Hannah, and I will be reaching out to you on the email on your Patreon account. And for the rest of you, please do join us at patreon.com/AskHistorians and do enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by user amandycat, who is flared on Ask Historians as early modern English death culture, who has to be one of the more stark and interesting flairs we have on the subreddit. She is better known to her friends and family as Amanda Brunton, a PhD student at Anglia Ruskin University in the United Kingdom, and she's here today to talk to us about the history and culture surrounding death and death culture in early modern England. First things first, welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
So let's start where I always like to start. What got you interested in history in general?
So I didn't start out as a historian at all. By trade, my degrees are all in literature so far. I got really into studying historical literature really young. I was really lucky and grew up in an area where we had a couple of big stately homes nearby. My mum worked in one, so that was where I used to hang out where I was a kid. And it got me really into studying Tudor history. So that was where I really picked it up.
You got interested through as a child, and then you went to university to study literature?
I did, but I as far as possible kind of stuck with early modern literature. That was kind of where the passion lay for me. So as I say, when I grew up hanging out in this house, they had priest holes, which was great. My mum got stuck in one.
Oh, wow.
They found it when moving some furniture around. She was like, I wonder what's in here, and just got completely stuck, which I found fascinating. Things like passages behind wood paneling so that servants could move around without people seeing them. And I just kind of loved the idea of finding out about the history of just a household even. So yeah, when I came to the chance to study literature, because that was kind of my main passion at school, I stuck with that kind of early modern stuff. But I found that the further on with it you go, the more of a historian you kind of become.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
So the area of research I've ended up in now has ended up kind of split pretty 50-50 between literature and history, because I'm dealing with a lot of manuscript transmission and that kind of thing. So how people write down texts and pass them around is kind of ultimately as important as the texts themselves you get your hands on.
Absolutely. Actually, to expand on that a little bit, so you would kind of consider yourself more of a cultural historian with that overlap between history and culture and literature more than a diplomatic historian or a military historian, right?
Yeah, definitely. So I love reading through the stuff on the Ask Historians post when people come up with that military kind of information, because it's just so different to what I do. I definitely would say I end up basically being a literary historian.
Mm-hmm.
I did my master's in early modern literature, and so I did a lot of stuff on poetry and drama and that kind of thing. And as I got more and more into manuscript studies, that was when I started looking at cultural artifacts. How do people make meaning around their lives and write that down, that kind of thing. I think it's a really important way to look at history alongside the more kind of nitty gritty historian stuff, like you mentioned with like military historians and that kind of thing, because it's kind of exploring how things happen and how people feel about it as much as what happened, when, and why. Yeah, I always found that a really interesting way to approach history.
I mean, as a personal bias, I have to expand here that I would absolutely agree with that, because I come at, obviously studying a very different field than you, but I come at it from a very similar angle, in that what people wrote down and how they understood what they were writing down and how they even got access to what they were reading is important, in some ways more important for studying how we got culture than, for example, who might have won a little battle.
Yeah, I mean, I loved hearing about your stuff with like history of pornography and that kind of thing, because the type of material that people will copy down in manuscripts in the period that I study, quite often it's fairly pornographic because it just can't be printed at that time. So that's the only way to circulate that kind of text. So you get things like Nash's Choice of Valentines, which is a fairly rare text. Yeah, I thought you might know that one.
That's one of my favorites for sure.
It's everyone's favorite. So if you haven't heard of Choice of Valentines, and you are desperately missing out, but this guy kind of turns up in a brothel on Valentine's Day, and he has a bit of performance anxiety, and it doesn't go so well for him. And the poem goes into lots of detail about the prostitute trying really hard to help this guy get hard. And like in some versions, eventually she just grabs a dildo and decides actually she only needs that really anyway. So yeah, you get copies that have been taken down in code or written backwards, tucked away in manuscript, because it was just the only place that you could get a hold of Nash's Choice of Valentines. And that turns up alongside all manner of other weird and wonderful material. One of my colleagues is looking at a manuscript that she had studied for the kind of pornographic Nash content, and also found loads of epitaphs alongside it. Like, that's a completely reasonable thing to keep with your pornography.
So I think to expand a second, for listeners that aren't necessarily aware of what it means to have a manuscript, I think a lot of people imagine like a dusty roll tucked away in a basement, or that's not
the
so
big
much the common
medieval manuscripts. I think a lot of people also will think of things like the big illuminated medieval manuscripts with lots of gold and that kind of thing on it. But that's really kind of the opposite of the stuff that I handle.
What would a manuscript at this time look like? A commonplace book, right?
Yeah, so the sort that I look at most frequently tend to be commonplace books, and those, in terms of what they look like, can be quite varied. They come in all shapes and sizes. Some are very tatty, random bits of paper kind of roughly stitched together. Others, someone has bought quite a nice notebook, basically. And what they contain will be miscellanea. It was considered aspect of a good humanist education to be able to just kind of trot out witty sayings at a moment's notice. And so boys at school were taught to keep these commonplace books where they copied down things that they thought were witty or funny or profound or complex or challenging. And so they will just be a little snapshot of what an individual person felt was worth copying down, perhaps either for later discussion or just for their own amusement. Other times you get things like house books. So if you had a large house where all the accounts needed to be kept, you would have things like rental records, trading records with merchants nearby to get household goods in, how much have you paid the servants, who came to visit. But you get all kinds of other bits of ephemera just kind of shoved in there with it, which is always really delightful, because it's just whatever someone put in the margins of this expensive chunk of paper.
Right. I think that's really interesting, because you mentioned Nash's Valentines, which is a erotic poem that, like you said, it's a man trying to get with a prostitute. He has performance anxiety, and we have this reconstructed version, just like we might have a reconstructed poem of Marlowe, for example. And what we mean by that is that there might be 15, 16 versions out there, and lit historians have gone back and like pieced it together, essentially, right?
Yeah, exactly. So when you pick up off of the shelf like a complete works of John Donne or something like that, it gives a very false idea of what texts like that circulated as at the time. So it would be like a game of telephone. The game you play as children, where you whisper something in somebody's ear and they pass on whatever they hear, and at the end of the chain you end up with a completely different message. So people will copy down a poem that they've seen in someone else's book, or they've got straight a copy straight from the poet, perhaps, but they might dislike some of the phrasing and want to change it. They might want to personalize it. They might have a duff copy they copy from themselves. And so you'll end up with sometimes hundreds of versions of a particularly popular poem. So when we get something like a complete works, someone has kind of painstakingly gone through all of these versions, or as many as they can get their hands on, to decide what's the most authoritative reading for like each word, each line, and reconstructed it that way.
And sometimes I think it's more interesting to even look at some of those original ones and realize, like, I don't know if I'd agree with this particular historian choosing this rhyme scheme or that particular line to go with.
Yeah, definitely. And there are things to be lost in that kind of thing where you tend to see modernized spellings. It's quite late before we get a standardized orthography. And so you'll get things like, particularly in early modern lyric verse, you get puns on heart as in a deer, and heart as in like, oh, my beating heart.
Right.
And those kind of puns are very fluid and flexible when you don't have to spell something exactly the same way. But once you standardize a spelling, you have to choose one reading.
I guess poem close to my heart would be the works of Pietro Arantino, in which the Victorian translator went through all of the recorded versions, and his translation comes out to like, let us quest, my love, let us quest across the field of battle. And when a modern translator goes through, it's more like, let us fuck, my love, let us fuck.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, early modern poets themselves were quite often quite keen on doing translations as part of their humanist education, to be able to take the classic texts and reappropriate them. So Marlowe quite famously translated Ovid, and comes up with some translations that are not necessarily the word for word style of translation, but something that makes a beautiful piece of poetry in English, in the target language. So it's kind of taking part in a pretty long-standing tradition to be editing poetry like this. So I don't want to disgrace it too much. But yeah, I tend to be in the archive picking up a 400-year-old manuscript and just seeing what's in it. And so I have ended up where I'm collating lots of different examples of epitaphs together. I have ended up with lots of versions of the same thing, but very often that's quite telling, particularly in something like an epitaph where you might feel that it might be very personal, like this is grandpa's epitaph, and then you'll see it copied again for somebody else.
Right. So like when I'm working with the older material I work with tend to be church court records, and they tend to only be one particular copy is like the only authoritative version because it's a record from a church. So when you're diving through all these 400-year-old manuscripts, does it make you feel a little bit like Indiana Jones?
Oh, always. I never go to the archive without my hat, my whip. Yeah. It's very important when slogging through your 5th day of transcriptions to make yourself feel like a historical rock star. So
you're studying, and I guess you're flaired particularly in death culture, which is a step away from what a lot of people would really turn to. Like, I obviously turn to history of pornography. Others might turn to like, well, poetry or literature or plays. So what about death attracts you?
I think that it's particularly interesting because it's something that feels objectively like it should be really constant. It's something that happens to every single one of us, and the way it might happen might be different, but it's something that it feels like it should be the same, but it fundamentally isn't. And the beliefs about death might be so strongly held and so profound that it does literally change the experience of dying. And so it gives you this kind of really carefully controlled constant to be able to look at how people approach something really differently in a different period of time. And it's something that people take very seriously and very personally. So I know that every historian wants to caution against like from the beginning of time statements because they're very rarely true. But I think that things like the ritualization of death is something that really stands out as something that humanity has pretty much always wanted to do. Like we find prehistoric graves that come with evidence of ritual in the form of grave goods. Even when there's very little left of the body itself, we can see that they might have been buried with certain types of beads or pots or jars or whatever. And so that's something that is really, really constant. And people have these very deeply held beliefs about what should and shouldn't happen when someone dies. So when that is challenged or goes wrong or subverted, it produces havoc usually. And it's very telling to look at what people's responses are when death kind of goes bad. So that's kind of what got me into it. I was looking at plays of Christopher Marlowe because his plays are almost universally a bloodbath.
And who's Marlowe?
Christopher Marlowe was a playwright who was a direct contemporary of Shakespeare. He died considerably younger than Shakespeare, and so has a much smaller canon of works. But he was writing at pretty much exactly the same time and was extremely popular. So his play, The Massacre at Paris, exactly as the name suggests, a total bloodbath. And it had the highest takings for the season in the theatre. So he's a really useful point to look at in terms of how people perceive death and like their expectations of what does and doesn't fly when it comes to staging it. So The Massacre at Paris is a play about the massacre of Protestants in Catholic France, which had happened within living memory at the point that the play was staged, and was performed to a largely Protestant audience. It was massively popular, even though it's kind of B-movie funny. So the Protestants are kind of massacred in this really offhanded kind of, oh, look, he's dead sort of way. And I've seen academics compare it to things like putting on a play about the Holocaust in front of second generations after Holocaust survivors and expecting them to laugh.
I think that's very interesting. I think a lot of cultures, the two things cultures tend to revolve around are both death and birth and marriage to some extent, are the three the anthropologists usually identify as that all cultures have rituals surrounding.
Yeah, definitely. And so looking at sort of what those expectations of dying are, how they change, how they vary within the same society at roughly the same point of time, how they get subverted in terms of libels, in terms of drama, that kind of thing, I think is really instructive to look at like where cultural anxieties lie within that society.
So one of the older, maybe slightly dated historians would have said that, oh, well, people back then, they died so young, and, you know, that there was never really any time to form attachment, and mothers weren't really attached to their babies, and children weren't really sad. So is that accurate, or would you say the perception of death is wrong?
So I think the person that you're talking about then, if I remember correctly, is Lawrence Stone, who's kind of the biggest proponent of that argument, where he's just saying people had so many babies that all died so young. How could one possibly remember each and every one of them, care about them? And it is something that's really challenging to address. It's like the loss of a young child in a family now would be just considered the most appalling trauma. And imagine if you had to go through that over and over and over again, not just you, but everyone around you. And so reaching for a solution to something like that, I think that the beginnings of that conversation come from just kind of reaching for a solution that seems radical, just to try and explain something that feels so alien. It's not something that I think that most historians would interpret it as now. Evidence would seem to suggest that the whole lack of familial attachment to young children is just not correct. There are some really famous literary examples, like Ben Jonson's epitaphs for his first son and his first daughter, which are very tender and very loving and suggest pretty profound grief. So those are the examples that I think are kind of, they're the things that people study at school. They're commonly well known enough. But you also see things about, there's a lot of emphasis placed on how you should educate your children, how you should bring them up. Epitaphs for young children are reasonably popular, like there's a lot of them, and people collect them together in a way that suggests communal grieving. So there's a really interesting collection of epitaphs that a scholar called Marcy L. North draws attention to, where epitaphs for the young Crown Prince Henry, who died tragically young, are collected alongside epitaphs for just common-born children. And it kind of takes this national tragedy where there's this young man who's expected to be the next great monarch, just suddenly dies. And this huge, profound national loss is felt, but that's actually reconciled on a very local level, where that kind of loss can be rationalized in much the same way as the loss of your own infant can be taken on, which seems to suggest, to me at least, that people took the death of a child very seriously. Records for how people felt about children are obviously much more detailed than how children felt about the loss of their siblings and things like that. I would say that the historical records errs on the side of a much more loving family unit than Lawrence Stone gives credit for.
I mean, not to discredit Lawrence Stone, because he did make a very pioneering work, but that does particularly stick out to anybody which just has the slightest sort of human feeling. I think Stone particularly, at least when I'm approaching it from my field, tries too hard to make his evidence fit his theory.
Yeah.
And that's probably his biggest weakness as a scholar.
But actually, I think it is kind of important to, as a historian, you're kind of layering interpretations of events.
Right.
So things like, there's something I mentioned earlier when we were talking about this podcast, where how do you deal with things like homosocial and homosexual relationships in the early modern period? So I find epitaphs that appear to be for loving, committed same-sex couples. And there's a great book about this, and I cannot think of the name of the author. I'm going to have to look it up later, called The Friend. And it pulls out an example of a couple at Gonville and Caius College in Cambridge, where the epitaph is set up in a way that suggests kind of undying love for the deceased partner as laid down by the living partner. The monument in the chapel is set up, as you might expect, for man and wife. And so you might well look at that relationship and think, gay relationship.
Yeah.
But that kind of structure of a gay identity, rather than it being something you do and something you are, you're applying an anachronistic perspective on something that perhaps would have been viewed really, really differently. And so as a historian, you're coming to something which is fundamentally kind of alien and working out your best way of negotiating what the most accurate way of representing that is. And sometimes it, as the case of Lawrence Stone, trying to work out how do people feel about the death of an infant, may well feel extremely alien. And you're adding a layer of your voice and your interpretation and what you've got to offer based on your research in the full knowledge that someone's going to come along 5, 10, 20 years later with a new primary source or a new interpretation of it that we hope will inch us a little bit closer to a more fundamental understanding. So it's really important, I think, not to just go to town on scholars whose views have become kind of outdated, because you have to kind of keep this awareness, especially when you're looking at something as a cultural historian, where a lot of it is kind of wishy-washy, that perspectives are going to change.
Yes, to unpack that just a little bit on what you're saying about, for example, gay and lesbian relationships, you wouldn't have had those concepts of gay or lesbian relationship till probably after the trial of Oscar Wilde in the late 1800s. So that concept of a gay man that does gay things and has a gay personality, hangs out with gay people, isn't in existence. And you have to kind of go by the old L.P. Hartley quote that says the past is a different foreign country. They do things differently there. Yeah, definitely. And I mean, this is something that comes up fairly regularly on the main Ask Historians subreddit, where people ask about queer history and that kind of thing. And it's something that I do kind of stumble across periodically in the line of my research, where it's how do you commemorate a relationship that doesn't necessarily follow obvious lines within the time in which it was produced. So it's important to remain alive to the idea that something might well be strange. They might do things differently there, and try and very carefully and respectfully pick apart your sources and work out the best way of interpreting them. Great. So let's go that way. So how did you begin to structure this idea of death into a PhD thesis? It very much kind of came straight out of my master's. I was very lucky in that regard. So my master's was great insofar as it gave me a really thorough grounding in things like using archives, archival history, paleography. And so one of the assignments that I was set towards the end of the master's was how to do a manuscript description. So I had to go find a manuscript that was fairly sizable and offer a description of how it was put together, who it was written by, what its contents were like. And I found this great little commonplace book from roughly 1620. It's a tiny little document, and it's mostly concerned with poems about a rivalry between Oxford and Cambridge universities, which were great fun. So in 1615, Cambridge hosted James I. And so Oxford were obviously very keen to point out that their entertainments had been better when they last hosted the king, and Cambridge was very keen to point out that obviously they beat Oxford hands down, and the king had a much better time with them, which is really entertaining. There's lots of stuff like Richard Corbett, that kind of thing, and then partly through it just swaps to epitaphs, and there's this huge chunk. Some of them are quite somber, quite serious. Others are short and rude. So it was this weird juxtaposition both between the epitaphs and the other content that they were collected with. And then once I started looking at more and more of those types of documents for comparison, I saw that actually lots of commonplace books have this section of epitaphs. It was just something people like to copy out. And I gave my kind of love of drama a bit of a last hurrah with my thesis and went on to look at Marlowe. But in the course of doing that, I was obviously researching death culture and was coming across other manuscript sources that were talking very frankly about death and dying, and collating together lots of epitaphs and that kind of thing. And so when it came to
pulling together a PhD thesis out of it, I felt like I really had some unfinished business with that little manuscript, and thought, why is there such a compulsion to copy down loads and loads of epitaphs? And so that's really where it began. It feels like such a peculiar thing to want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And but sometimes really incongruous. Yeah, exactly. And I think the closest analog is probably the kind of like little autograph books people used to carry around in schools, and you'd have your classmates sign them. They would copy down funny poems. They've kind of gone out of vogue now, but like my grandma had.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably something like, if you're looking for a modern analog, probably similar to that. So yeah, I started looking at, why are people copying these down? Where do they copy them? Who gets epitaphs? And it became kind of more of an exercise of taxonomy after a while, because there were just so many. Once I started looking, it was difficult to know where to stop looking. And so it started to become more of a task of cataloguing what I found, finding ways to categorize them. Were there any generic features that were very repetitive? How can you compare like one document and its collection of epitaphs to another? Mm-hmm. Is it different when it turns up in a commonplace book to scribbled into the margins of a printed book? And so the project really ended up being kicked off with just creating this big taxonomy of epitaphs, which is just an ongoing monstrosity. It just keeps on getting added to.
I mean, that's the case with all PhD research or book research. As I can entail that giant pile of papers next to my desk.
Yeah, it just never stops. I'm at several hundred epitaphs now, and there's always something else. I'm like, oh, that's just too good not to put it in there. And like I've become known as the girl who does epitaphs now. So every now and again, someone on Twitter will be like, I found this really cool manuscript, you need to have a look. But having done that kind of splitting it apart, that kind of taxonomy type work, I started looking at, okay, once you've got that data, how can you kind of salami slice it for picking out interesting chunks of data? And so one of the first things I looked at was the way that dialogue functions in them, for example. So most epitaphs, you'll have this kind of disembodied speaker that's very anonymous that will say, here lies so-and-so. But then every now and again, the dead just kind of start talking back like, yep, this is me here, which was really unexpected to me. It just kind of, it doesn't feel very reverential just to have the dead rock up and start chatting back. And obviously has some really interesting religious ramifications. Like, what does it mean to make the dead do the talking? So that was a big part of kind of my early exploration of it. I'm moving on to now looking at more of the funny and silly epitaphs and get on to something a little bit more lighthearted. And there are a lot of them as well, so I've got plenty to work with.
Right, so let's give probably a better picture of what it would have looked like before you got the epitaphs. What would a funeral of that era look like? How would the people have mourned and gone about doing that before writing the epitaph?
It's something that varies depending on what point in early modern history you're studying. Of course, it was a pretty tumultuous time for religious change. So a Catholic deathbed, funeral and mourning process is fundamentally quite different to a Protestant one. And a rich person's deathbed, funeral and mourning will be very different from a poor person's. So the whole process kind of kicks off with the act of dying. It's very communal compared to what we might expect now. So if a member of the community is known to be in their sickbed, expected to die, you could imagine that there would be something like a peal of bells to summon people to the bedside. And if you're still talking about a Catholic England, definitely call them to prayer, to pray for this person's soul to pass through purgatory reasonably speedily. People would come to the bedside to keep the dying person company. This was considered very important. So there were a series of handbooks published around this time known as collectively as the Ars Moriendi, or the art of dying. And they stress the importance of having people nearby to counsel the dying person, make sure that they don't succumb to despair, hopelessness. If they get visions of the devil at the foot of their bed, which were really quite common, make sure that they were reminded that, you know, God's salvation is there. This is something that becomes a very kind of Protestant fixation, reminding them of the grace of God in the face of the devil apparently just sitting on the end of the bed. So it's very important to have the community there with you if possible. And several of these Ars Moriendi books kind of set it up as like a dialogue. So you'll have the dying person talking to somebody who's counselling them. Thomas Bacon's A Sick Man's Salve is a really good example of this. If you were still dealing with a Catholic deathbed, then you would definitely be expected to be given the last rites, offered the sacrament where possible. And this was really crucial. So I found an example during my master's actually of a commissary court record for a woman called Alice Gisby. And
yes, tell us about that one.
Alice Gisby, yeah, it's a really, really desperately sad case. So the commissary court record is, of course, somebody who's come along to make a record of the will, and has apparently stumbled across the most traumatic and upsetting deathbed scene. So this is from 1538, and Alice was suffering from a growth across her neck, presumably some kind of cancer. And so people realised that she's not long for this world. They tried to summon the priest. If I recall correctly, the priest is a one-legged man named Biggins, which just kind of adds to the whole drama that's about to unfold, I think. They have to summon him from the tavern. He doesn't come very quickly. And Alice's growth across her neck has got to the point now where it has reduced her speech to a gurgle, and then eventually she can't speak. It ruptures, it covers her in blood.
Oh gosh.
It's a really disastrous way to go. So by the time the priest arrives, she can't take part in the last rites. She can't speak, and actually she's too sick to even just look at the wafer that's offered to her to indicate that even if she can't talk, she's definitely of the right mindset for a dying person. It wasn't just enough to live well, you had to die well as well and show that you had your mind on Christ. And so when she can't pray or look at the wafer, the priest and the other attendants there, so fellow women, they described as knocked her upon the breast, and the women start shouting at her, "Will you die like a hellhound and a beast, not remembering your maker?" Trying to get her to speak. So they are literally flogging a dying woman. And that's one of the things that it's the kind of part and parcel of treating your sources respectfully, I guess, because this seems really troubling to a modern reader, because you are beating someone who's already probably not really conscious. But for Alice's loved ones, this is not just a matter of life and death. This is keeping somebody, rescuing them from hell. And that is so important, that you can inflict, effectively torment a still living body. So that ability to perform your death correctly is really, really important. They make for brutal reading.
A little bit of Zen in the morning, isn't it?
Absolutely. That is my PhD, Zen in the morning. So the Ars Moriendi texts do kind of recognise that you might not be lucky enough to die at home in your sickbed, surrounded by family. Like accidents were common, so were plagues. And so you might actually just die unexpectedly. So it's really important to kind of live your life in anticipation of death, so that your sins are regularly reconciled with God. And this, later on in the period, again, is something that becomes an object of really intense fixation for Puritans. They get given prayer books and handbooks that remind them that it's a daily exercise of confessing your sins and remembering that you are a sinner. So yeah, there is always this warning to just be prepared for death. I don't know how seriously everyone would have taken that. It's difficult to imagine living your entire life worrying that you might drop dead, but that's certainly what they're encouraged to do.
And it was something that surrounded you. In a lot of the biographies I read, it's constantly surrounded you. People were dying constantly from sickness, from illness, and you would get these, like you mentioned, these books that would teach you how to live and how to prepare for death every day. And reading itself also was a social act. You might only have one reader or two readers in the whole town, so they would be reading, this is how you prepare yourself for a good death, to a whole audience, the whole family even.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that actually it was pretty much expected that you would read aloud, even in private study. So yeah, it could be a very social activity. And even when it's not something that's social in terms of who's there in front of you right in that moment, we do see books that are annotated with clear intent for sharing them with your annotations. So yeah, reading is not necessarily quite such a solitary pastime as you might imagine.
Right.
Once somebody has kind of got through the hurdle of having a good death, the funeral then has a few kind of fairly constant features and quite a lot of changeable ones. So the corpse has to be dressed correctly for the grave. They have to be in a winding sheet, and it's just unthinkable to put someone to the grave naked. So there are cases where somebody who has kind of stumbled into the parish completely unknown and has died, and maybe even found sometime later, sort of after winter, and then the parish buries them at their expense, and they will, and listed in the costs will be a winding sheet. And so even in the case where somebody might actually be quite decayed at the point you find them and bury them, they have to be appropriately dressed for the grave.
What's a winding sheet?
That's a shroud. So you would wrap somebody in the sheet to prepare them for death. And actually, John Donne's tomb monument quite famously has him wrapped in his winding sheet. So that's definitely worth a Google. He had an etching or an engraving of some sort done of it that he used to keep by his bed, where he had in life posed in this shroud.
Oh my gosh, I've seen that monument. I know what a winding sheet is, but I didn't know he had it alive when he was still alive.
Yeah,
he was dead.
He posed for that live, and he kept the drawing of himself at hand to meditate on death. He was a serious dude. So yeah, you had to have the corpse correctly prepared. They would not necessarily be buried in a coffin. Good odds that you would be carried to your grave in one, but they might be multi-purpose. So you might have a community-held coffin where you'd be transported to the grave, and then it would be used for the next person. So that's something that definitely feels very alien to a modern reader when you see things like that. If you were wealthy and you had permission, you might well be buried inside the church, but for most people, you'd be outside in what they called God's Acre. You'd be in the graveyard outdoors. There would be a peal of bells for the funeral, and there would be some kind of service. Very often that was just at the graveside. But if you were a clergyman or somebody of good standing, then you might well have a funeral sermon preached. And certainly later on in this period, you see examples of people leaving in their will the costs of having a sermon written up, preached and printed for the edification of the poor, basically. It's one of your last charitable acts to make sure that there is a decent funeral sermon that could be circulated. And these are quite popular. We have quite a lot of funeral sermons still extant. Prayers would be said after or during the service. Catholic services would, of course, include a funeral mass. Protestant services would not. The giving of masses is something that was one of the really hotly contested parts of the Reformation as England went back and forth between Protestant and Catholic. So Protestant service would not include a mass. Funerals for wealthy people came with a lot more baggage. So mourners would be clothed in mourning attire, and that would be paid for out of the estate of the deceased. That might be something quite simple. It might involve a full outfit of clothing, rings, ribbons, lace. It could be quite extravagant. And when you get onto later periods like the Victorian era, you get like full catalogues of mourning attire. It becomes something which is very commercialized and expected. And you kind of see the beginnings of that in this period. So that mourning attire might be very expensive and elaborate. And mourners might well be paid members of the community. So you might well see a small sum of money paid to people for carrying the coffin. So that's something that we would now regard as like an honour to be asked to do that, whereas in this period it's looked at as more of a duty. And perhaps the most interesting part for me, if you were of a social status to have been literate and to have literate friends, they may well come along with epitaphs for you, which would be pinned to your hearse or your coffin. These are obviously really ephemeral. They're not going to stay around for very long, being bits of paper that have been kind of stuffed onto a coffin. But you do see later, afterwards, presumably, people copy them down into their own manuscript, and they will make reference to the fact that they have been written for this purpose. So there's one that begins with the words, "My pen did ne'er expect to deck thy hearse." So there is this kind of separate little bit of culture where an epitaph might not actually be a permanent stone monument, but expected to be part of the ephemera of the funeral, which I find really interesting. And there's a court case I'm very excited to go and look at the details of in the Kew Archives, where a court case comes before the Star Chamber because somebody has pinned an epitaph to a coffin which is libelous about the deceased. And they actually go so far as to take that to court. I don't know how it pans out yet. I haven't made the trip there yet, but I'm excited to see how that worked out.
I'll have to follow up with you on that one, because that played in all sorts of issues with the Star Chamber, especially.
Yeah, I mean, James I was really keen on prosecuting libels. He was very keen not to have the higher social orders, or in fact the royal family themselves, be lambasted in libels. So they were kind of hot property to own. You couldn't print them on the whole, and you could get in serious trouble for composing or owning them. So it's really interesting to see something like that come before the Star Chamber. So yeah, I'll have to follow back up with you on how that works out. I don't even know what the contents of the libel were at this stage.
For a libel, you have to print it technically, like it's in the word. It's libelous, like for a little book.
I mean, I think that now, yes, you would consider it needing to be printed because that's the means by which you make it available for popular circulation. But it's really important to remember that in this period that manuscript was a much more readily available and potentially equally public way of circulating information.
I see.
So if you wanted to write a libel, then the easiest way to get it widely circulated is to pass it around in manuscript, and people will find it funny and copy it down. And so owning a manuscript libel is exactly, in the case of somebody
it's almost exactly the same thing,
to an epitaph, it's enough. So yeah, prints and manuscript kind of still sit alongside each other as not exactly competing, but certainly different means of publication.
So to step away from the manuscripts for a moment, the one thing you haven't mentioned with the death and the funeral, what about the gravestone? I mean, that's much more, is that just a modern invention, or?
To some degree, like in the form that we would expect to walk into a churchyard and see gravestones, yes. It certainly comes from after this period to expect everyone to have some kind of headstone. So if you were buried outdoors, in all likelihood, you wouldn't get a headstone of some kind. People sometimes put up their own kind of wooden monuments, or maybe made of brick, and they would sometimes just be cleared up and taken down by the church warden once they were cluttering the graveyard too much. So we know from records of them being cleared away that things like these existed, but we also know that they probably were never meant to last. So it's an incomplete historical record in that regard. But if you were wealthy and you had the permission of the church, you could have the privilege of being buried inside the church in some way, whether that's in a crypt or under the floor or in the walls. And in that case, you would have some kind of monument with an epitaph on it. Again, this is a frustratingly incomplete historical record, not least because not all churches survive. They get burned down, they get demolished and replaced. But also there was a real issue where once England felt like it was comfortably Protestant for a good long while, people started destroying overtly Catholic grave monuments because they were deemed too popish. And so it gets serious enough that at one point Elizabeth I has to issue a decree forbidding the destruction of church monuments so that they can be preserved. And she stipulates that they have to be intended for the preservation of memory in good faith, not to promote the Catholic religion. So there is still some leeway there for if something is just too outrageously Catholic. She does kind of leave some leeway for if something is so outrageously Catholic, you can potentially get rid of it. But it had certainly become enough of a problem that a royal would acknowledge it. In terms of what those monuments might have looked like, some were made of local stone, some were marble, some might be monumental brasses, there might be a gravestone in the floor, or it might be an enormous monument. So the kind that you see in English churches where you've got somebody kind of laying down prone with a big canopy over them as though they're in bed. Those can be really quite enormous. And there are certainly complaints that take place when churches become seriously crowded with monuments about whether or not it's a kind of idolatry. Some of them will have really basic epitaphs on them. They'll include the name of the deceased, the date of the death, age at time of death, like date of birth if it's known, and any noteworthy family connections or anyone else that's kind of been interred with them. So you will see somebody who is buried, and then you have so-and-so wife of, and their 16 million children. Often these graves are said like they have a lengthy list of children that have been buried with them, and it will normally be the case that they're actually interred in a crypt as well, because just the space constraints would be enormous.
Insane, yeah.
Yeah, so at its most basic, an epitaph is there to identify and commemorate the dead.
Right.
But larger and much more flowery examples do exist, where they include short poems and requests for prayer if they're pre-Reformation epitaphs as well. So it's very common to have an epitaph say things like, "As I am now, so shall you be." So it's really important that you pray for my soul in the hope that when it comes to your turn, people will do the same for you. Quite a lot of those survive, I think, because that commonplace carries on in a modified form. So yeah, it's quite variable what would pass for an epitaph, but it has these kind of basic requirements of identification and commemoration.
Right, but in general, you're studying the manuscript formats, and how would those have differed? They're much more populous than the stone ones?
Yes, they are, and for numerous reasons, and quite different to their stone counterparts very often, because you're not constrained by space limitations and costs. Okay. So if you want to have a lengthy epitaph in a church, you've got to be able to have a very large lump of rock and somebody to engrave it all for you, and that is pricey. Whereas by comparison, paper, quills and ink are very cheap. People are much more keen to wax quite lyrical when it comes to epitaphs and manuscripts, and you sometimes get something that's 70 or 80 lines long and you think, surely this is an elegy at this point. So they're quite different in form, and yes, there's more of them because it's very easy to just copy down a whole selection for your own kind of private interest, whereas a graveyard is kind of constrained by space and just the very simple question of how many people are actually buried there.
So you mentioned a couple different, like, are there the different genres? You mentioned like poetry ones, you mentioned ones that even slid into libel. What are the different genres of epitaphs?
It's very difficult to make hard and fast categories for these epitaphs because there is so much overlap between them. It's not helpful to assume that they will definitely fit into one thing or another, but there are some broad categories which are helpful. As long as you're kind of mindful of the fact that they can be many of them at once. So one of the most interesting distinctions to make is whether something is, broadly speaking, mournful or not. An epitaph might be so trivial and so inconsequential that it doesn't appear to have any kind of intense feeling for a given person included in it. So you get brief epitaphs, like there's one for children where it's as mothers do their children's bed to lay, when too long the wantons want to play. And then it ends with, nature, my nurse, laid me to bed. So let me see if I can actually find the actual epitaph rather than just
definitely
reading it to you wrong, because I know I'll have it right here. Here we go. So it's careful mothers to their beds do lay, their babes which too long the wantons play. So to prevent my youth's lingering crimes, nature, my nurse, laid me to bed betimes.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's really, I have no doubt that this could potentially be used as a genuinely felt epitaph, because it does kind of neutralize and rationalize a death. And so it does come off as mournful in that sense, but it's also not expressing any kind of grief either. So other epitaphs will really be lamenting a loss. And in this case, that sense kind of isn't there. In fact, death is kind of framed as ultimately reasonably positive because it's wished for in order to prevent my youth lingering crimes. So yeah, you get this kind of odd contrast between epitaphs that seem mournful or not. And of course, you have no way of knowing whether or not something that's been composed into a manuscript is written because the person who's writing it down is in mourning. So you have to be very careful about making those kind of judgments, but it does help just kind of make broad cuts through the data. Other ways to look at it is whether or not it's something which is light-hearted and comical. That doesn't necessarily prevent it being mournful too. And so there's a really interesting little selection of epitaphs that come out of Christchurch College, Oxford, for their butlers. And there's a really delightful example. I know it feels weird to describe an epitaph as delightful, but it's written on the death of the butler, and it characterizes all of the items in his cellar coming out to take part in the funeral. Ooh. So the cheeses weep for example, the beer has replaced the water in the River Styx to transport John Dawson, the butler, down to the afterlife. And so the whole college has come out in mourning, to the extent that even the cheeses are weeping. Right. And there's definitely a sense there of loss and sadness, but it's also funny and silly all at the same time. So I
think that's kind of beautiful in a sense that you have the whole, it's funny, yes, but it's also like your death is so sad that even these inanimate objects come to mourn you.
Yeah, and I see
you can
that
laugh in the face of it.
Absolutely, and that is something that you definitely see in terms of laughing in the face of death, laughing at death's expense, particularly kind of post-Reformation epitaphs that will lament the loss of a person and then say ultimately they've cheated death though, because they are going to be resurrected and death's victory is very temporary.
Boom.
Yeah, that's it. That's the ultimate logic there. You can't possibly be grieving when someone's going to come straight back. And so that kind of mournful and comical tone is something that turns up quite often. Another really good example is Hobson the Cambridge Carrier. I don't know how well the expression has travelled outside of England, but have you ever heard the phrase Hobson's choice?
Hobson's choice?
It's something that is reasonably well known as an expression around here. So Hobson was effectively a courier. He would bring post to and from Cambridge and London. So he was a well-known figure both in the university and outside of it. And if you wanted to take a horse, you would get Hobson's choice, which is the next horse that's ready or none at all. So Hobson's choice has become a sort of phrase for you get what you're given, because he noticed that otherwise he had some horses that were constantly tired and never rested, and some that never got used. So
right.
But he was a wealthy figure, and he did some amazing charitable works in Cambridge. He helped pay to establish clean water in the city. So he was a very fondly held figure. And when he dies, there are a number of epitaphs written for him that presumably would never have gone anywhere near a gravestone. They were just written for manuscript circulation. And they tend to focus on things like he was so steadfast and sturdy, and his horses were so excellent that the only thing that could have felled Hobson was death. And so, yeah, you do get this sense of great loss of a real public figure, but also characterized in ultimately a kind of trivial and funny way. And as you've mentioned, you also get the ones that kind of take that little step further and go straight into libel. And those are very popular. Libels as a whole were a popular genre. So you would get figures at court who had participated in some kind of scandal, and libels would circulate. And you give that a real additional sting by suggesting that this actually deserves to be on their gravestone. The last word said about them should be this.
This is putting the nail in the coffin in a sense.
Yes, absolutely. So some of them are quite short, quite daft. Others are really brutal in their takedowns of public figures.
So one of the things I'm noticing you're focusing on is who is speaking to who and in what way. Is that how you're sorting the epitaphs?
Yes. So alongside these kind of distinctions between the tone of the epitaphs, one of the main ways I've sliced up the data is how the dialogue works. So who is talking to who? Who's privileged to get to do the talking? Who is the expected listener? Because someone has to be talking in an epitaph, even if it's that disembodied, here lies so-and-so. And so I found that a really interesting way to look at the ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. So you get epitaphs where you have that disembodied voice, and it's probably the most common and most easily recognizable form of epitaph. Like if you get a here lies statement, you know exactly what you're getting. But there are others where the dead do all of the talking, and the words are put directly in their mouths. So there's a very popular example which kind of makes the leap between both manuscript and gravestone, that reads, "Twice 12 years not fully told have I exchanged for a wished death." And it's entirely from the perspective of a young man, usually, who has died just before the age of 24 and is glad to have passed away, because the sooner you die, the longer you get to spend in heaven, goes the logic. And so you have this kind of ideal vehicle for a Protestant mindset in relation to death.
Yeah.
And that's very popular, and it gets copied down with twice 10 years instead of twice 12. So it gets kind of personalized and things like that. And so given that the idea of having the dead speak is kind of problematic, it's interesting to see when they do get to talk what they're allowed to say. So in cases like this, it is kind of is offering an exemplar. In others, like the one I read out earlier, where you have the baby actually doing the talking, saying that they are glad to have died, it gives this kind of similar exemplar, but in the mouth of a child that's probably too young to even speak. So there is a real kind of keenness to have the dead there as instructors to the living, and they end up being this kind of subset of the community, where that kind of social fabric gets upheld. So the tear in that fabric that's engendered by loss and death gets kind of repaired by having the dead still kind of play an active role in the community and educating others on how to be good Christian compared to death.
It strikes me how so very Puritan that is. We've died, but we're still watching you.
We are still watching, and we did a better job than you. There is this kind of this real sea change from those much more traditionally Catholic epitaphs, which are saying, please pray for me, I'm in purgatory, as I am now, so will you be. Don't think you're too good to do this heavy work of praying for me. And the much later, much more Reformed Protestant mindset epitaphs, where there is just this kind of expectation that you are now in heaven. And so you get this kind of blurring of the line with where the dead are speaking from as well. So sometimes it seems like death has come so soon, the soul hasn't even left yet. There's someone where you have like the dead speaking, and he says, I was stopped in my middle age and soon made dead. And you get the sense it's got this real immediacy, like haven't even had time for their soul to depart. And in other cases, it's as though they're almost talking from heaven. They have the assurance of knowing how this has all panned out and advising you to make sure you do the same.
So I'm going to try to draw us towards a kind of a general conclusion, but to focus on the comedy, for example, it does seem a little off-putting that there's like funny epitaphs. I think we've talked about, is it a way of mocking death, but are there any good zombie jokes?
I haven't found zombie jokes. I think that's something that becomes kind of culturally relevant much later, but I really wish there were. There are fart jokes.
Oh, let's hear the fart jokes.
So there's a poem that circulates called The Parliament Fart, which is really popular. And it's from it's a hearing in Parliament in 1607 where they're talking about naturalisation of the Scots. And someone in Parliament called Henry Ludlow famously ripped out an excruciatingly loud fart, which apparently kind of briefly called a halt to proceedings. It's just the most British piece of humour, I think. It's so Monty Python. And so this poem, The Parliament Fart, circulates where you just get these little vignettes about how each MP responded to this fart. And it's a political commentary on how each MP responds. And so you can imagine something now where like Theresa May just kind of covers her nose. Jeremy Corbyn complains about how we haven't really given the fart a good hearing. That's the kind of tone we're working with here. And so lots of different versions of it circulate, as you can well imagine, depending on the political leanings of whoever's copying it down. But there's a manuscript in the British Library where they've just taken this little section of it about the fart. And it just says, an epitaph upon a fart. Reader, I was born and cried, cracked so, smelt so, and so died. Which I just think is great. And it carries on, like Julius Caesar was my death, for he in Senate lost his breath, and not unlike in tomb doth lie the noble Romulus and I, and much like to Flora fair, I loathe the Commonwealth mine heir. So yeah, that absolutely made my day. When I found that, I just wanted to walk around the British Library reading and like, look, this is an epitaph for a fart. It's a 400-year-old fart joke. So I have no zombie jokes for you, but I do have a fart joke. So yeah, it does feel off-putting to have funny epitaphs, but it gets less off-putting when you think about the context in which they arise. So we've mentioned things like having a really high mortality rate. These are people who would be much more familiar with death than I think like most modern European or American commentators are. Death tends to be kind of institutionalized, take place in a hospital. There's not really an expectation that you'll necessarily be there for when somebody dies. Infant mortality rates were high. There were no antibiotics, immunizations, and disease could wipe out a whole community at a time. So there is this kind of familiarity in death and what it's like to be around lots of people dying all at once. So some comic epitaphs seem to just express this familiarity with death and this really kind of rugged acceptance to just facing it off with humor. Kind of like those epitaphs for the butler, where there is this sense of loss and mourning and tragedy, but also a willingness to look on the brighter side of it.
Always look on the bright side of life.
Absolutely. This whole thing is just Monty Python could have written my thesis. That's it. So yeah, there is this kind of rationalizing death through humor, and we certainly see that kind of thing now, where there's rarely a tragedy so bad we can't find a way to laugh it off, to process it. And there's definitely a kind of popular tolerance for silly epitaphs, not just in manuscripts, but in the more official form when they turn up on gravestones. There's this text called William Camden's Remains Concerning Britain, and it collects a lot of epitaphs. And at the end of all of this really heavy reading, he says that he wants to give some conceited, merry and laughing epitaphs in order to cheer up the reader. And some of them are really silly and daft and funny, and the ones that he can attest to having turned up in churchyards are a bit more tame. But what they have in common is this kind of sense of levity in death. The idea that you can just say, "Whoops, I'm dead," and not make too much of it. Quite often with the death saying, like, directly to the reader, "I'm dead, don't worry about it." Something along those lines. And so there is this kind of official acceptance or tolerance, at least, for that kind of grave writing. But the really ludicrous ones tend to come from manuscript. And my absolute favourite one that I have found so far, besides the fart joke, which is classic, is "Here lies Rich Taylor of Coleman Street, who had beard to his belly and belly to his feet."
Lived a good life.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, he drank his beer, he combed his beard, died. Yeah, I have no idea who this Rich Taylor of Coleman Street is. I would have no idea where to start for identifying whether or not he was known indeed for having a belly to his feet. But there is this kind of real willingness in manuscripts to laugh.
So those are like you just said, more socially condoned. What about the ones that aren't socially condoned, the libelous ones that we talked about? Can you talk about some of those?
You won't find those in a churchyard. And that's why I'm kind of keen to, when you make the distinction about libel being something which is printed, make it clear that these were circulated in manuscript in order to be given a wide audience. There are social figures that kind of don't deserve the ridicule, and there are some that kind of have definitely earned their poor reputation. So there's one for Lady Mary Lake. So she was a very Machiavellian figure. She is accused, at least, of having conspired to blackmail her son-in-law with the help of her daughter, hoping to get him to sign over property to her and her husband. And they threatened to go public with charges of impotence to get the marriage nullified. So it was a massive public and very sexualized scandal. And so epitaphs for her were really savage, because even worse than an immoral man is an immoral wife. So you have one that begins, "Here lies the breast of badness, vice's nurse." Oof. So they really kind of characterizing this kind of womanly evil. She's vice's nurse. She has kind of suckled this demon baby that's grown up to be a woman that's happy to charge her husband with impotence. So in cases like that, you can kind of see where the ire comes from. Other cases make sadder reading, I think, to a modern reader that perhaps doesn't have the same sense of particularly female criminality. So Lady Penelope Devereux is one example where her epitaph history is a little bit sad. So she was the darling of the Elizabethan court. She was beautiful, well educated. She's most likely the Stella, the Sydney's Astrophyll and Stella. And she was married most likely against her will to a man named Robert Rich. The marriage was very unhappy. They did have children, but she quite quickly had openly become an affair with Charles Blount, Baron Mountjoy. She eventually did get her divorce from Lord Rich, but she wasn't permitted to remarry and legitimise her children by Blount. So the two of them carried on living as husband and wife, and then eventually defied the law, and Lady Penelope married Blount in a private service. And she was then banished from court for her trouble. When she died, she was buried in an unmarked grave, which is particularly surprising given her ancestry and just quite how high status she was. So there's plenty of people that then feel the need to supply a fitting epitaph. So they tend to be quite spiteful in the way that they focus on her identity as an overly sexual woman and having had two men in her life. So one of them reads, "Here lies the Lady Penelope or the Lady Rich or the Countess of Devonshire, I cannot tell which."
Oof.
Yeah. Others pun on the slang of stone for testicles. This is really popular, actually. There's a Master Stone from Cambridge College, and when he dies, his students are particularly savage in laughing at his name. And a Mr. Prick as well, actually. And you can imagine what those epitaphs are like. And so the ones for Lady Penelope will marvel that she's buried under one stone, that in her life was not content with two.
Doof.
There's just no holds barred. And there's, I don't know what your policy on this podcast is with swears.
Oh, don't worry. I'm a historiography. You can swear as much as you like.
Yeah, you make a good point. So there's an epitaph that I think is probably associated with Lady Penelope's final husband, which reads, "Here lies John Chidley and Sir Charles Blount. One loved a horse, the other a cunt."
Yikes.
And it's obviously not really making it clear which one is the woman and which one is the horse. It's brutal.
Yeah.
And in particular, these kind of libels for transgressive women were really popular. They're widely copied. They go on lots of revisions as people kind of add their own sting to them. They get copied in little collections. So someone might have 3 or 4 Penelope epitaphs all at once.
I always use the woman as the example of the failing of culture, society.
Yes, yeah, exactly. There's not a lot of ways to get it right other than to just sit there quietly and pop out nice, healthy babies. And that wasn't really what she did with her life. And
No.
she's certainly vilified for it. So, yeah, the libels are quite many and varied. Some are much more harmless than others. And some, in fact, it's very, very difficult to identify their target. It's just one of those things that just gets lost to time because people are so careful about trying to make them not seem too much like libels, so that if you were given cause to justify them, you could say, "Oh, this isn't for a real person. This is just extemporizing on a theme here." And so, yeah, it just becomes very difficult to identify them. But others like this really stand out.
I think that brings us to kind of like a finalizing question. What do you think is important about early modern English death culture? What can we learn from it? What can we draw from it?
I think the most important thing to bear in mind when studying these things is that exactly the same then as now, beliefs and attitudes to death were not homogenous. Official discourses around death could be quite varied. The more Calvinist outlook that begins to get adopted later in the period is particularly grim, like think upon your sins, be in continual readiness of death. But that's certainly not representative of everyone's attitude to death and the kind of things they write down about it. And these epitaphs give us a really good way to look at how people address this informally, which gives us that wider picture. What did people think it was okay to make the dead say? What did they think about death? And you can see that even within a kind of broadly speaking reformed outlook, they might still be funny, serious, silly, very varied. And I mean, it's difficult to answer what you mean by in terms of what we can learn from it. So as historians, there's a great deal we can learn from this material and about people's attitudes. But if you're asking more broadly, what can we as fellow humans learn from their approach to death? I think that the thing that sticks with me most is the light-hearted attitude that is taken even in the face of a high mortality rate, often gruesome and unpleasant ways of dying, enormous loss of life when it comes to small babies, that even then it's possible to write an epitaph in a kind of semi-funny way where you can say, sometimes just happens and we have to learn how to deal with it. It's refreshing and helpful to remember that life ultimately does just go on. But the fascination for me, besides that really sturdy, keep calm and carry on attitude, is definitely just the massive breadth of attitudes you can see to how people are willing to treat their dead and commemorate them.
Great. I think that's probably the perfect ending. Oh, wait, one last question. Can I hire you to write my epitaph?
I don't think you want me to do that unless you want a really well-crafted epitaph for a fart.
You know, there are worse ways to be remembered.
I've had people ask me whether they know that I'm studying epitaphs, whether I've written my own or whether or not I would like to. And in fact, my husband asked me this, and I said, if you have something along the lines of, I ate a lot of cheese, I drank a lot of wine, it's been a good life.
Cheers. I can drink to that. I'm
perfectly happy with that as a commemoration of my life.
Well, thanks. I think this has been an amazing podcast. It's been super comprehensive, and there's been so many interesting things brought up. But I know we will definitely have some follow-up questions in the follow-up thread on Ask Historians. So I hope you will join us there for readers to ask any questions.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for having, and thank you for coming on the Ask Historians podcast today.
Thank you very much for inviting me on here. It's been a blast.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.